Hello, I'm John, and I wanted to read and do a little analysis of a Wallace Stevens poem, Invective against Swans. This was published in his first collection entitled Harmonium in 1923. And for a little bit of visual interest and reference, I have a photo said to be from 1929 of Stevens, then about 50, with his young daughter Holly. Uh, a sweeter image I could not imagine. I've spent about a week or week and a half thinking very deeply about this poem and doing some writing about it. I don't find it to be the most engaging of his poems. In fact, it can feel like a bit of a slog at times. But in terms of, well, I mean, if you want to think of a poem as something that's very condensed and concise, it encodes a tremendous amount of information. At least it's extremely, extremely suggestive. Although I have lots and lots of observations and ideas about this poem, I don't start with any sort of definite thesis statement. It would be nice by the end of my analysis that I can wrap it up, but given the difficulties of this poem, if I end my video or videos without a definitive reading of this poem, I wouldn't necessarily feel that I failed. I would like to look at the title of this poem in isolation, Invective against Swans. An invective is a curse. It is to abuse, to attack in language, and generally speaking, in a more elevated mode of language. In fact, invective, as I've written here, refers to, or it is a perhaps belonging to that genre of classical Roman rhetoric called the vituperatio, if I'm pronouncing that correctly. It is a means by which, let's say, members of high Roman society could attack each other in very, very flowery, very, very elusive language. In fact, ironically, you could say the only way that you would know you were being abused by someone is if you were cultured enough. So, in a sense, it is both a form of abuse, but you're also according someone a level of respect that they actually are cultured enough to know that they are being attacked by you. Now, I think back to my days of learning Latin in high school, and we read some Catullus, and we read some of his invective poems against, as memory serves me, a former object of his love interest. Within this tradition, rivals, be they rivals for love or rivals for status, could use invective against one another. Um, but what's strange here is that the invective is not directed against a particular rival, a person, it's directed against swans. Now, swans figure heavily, even up to the present day, in poetry. Uh, the mythological record abounds in swans and in fables as well. So one could imagine that swans were weaponized in invective. A swan perhaps concealed an attack against a rival. Um, but it is a means of attack, potentially, um, but certainly not a target of attack. And although we normally speak about a swan in having a mythological meaning, being used in a particular allusion, this is not simply an invective against a particular swan, it is an invective against swans as a class. Now, I guess my thesis question would be, well, what does the speaker have against swans, and why is he hurling invective against them? Why is he using rhetoric against a feature of rhetoric, so to speak? Well, why don't we just start by reading the poem? Always a good place to start. The soul, O ganders, flies beyond the parks and far beyond the discords of the wind. A bronze rain from the sun descending marks the death of summer, which that time endures, like one who scrawls a listless testament of golden quirks and Paphian caricatures, bequeathing your white feathers to the moon and giving your bland motions to the air. Behold, already on the long parades the crows anoint the statues with their dirt. And the soul, O ganders, being lonely, flies beyond your chilly chariots to the skies. I'd like to spend some time with the first part of the first line, the soul, O ganders. First, O ganders. Well, O is a rather dated form of address, a dated form of rhetoric. It connects with the sense of invective as a rhetorical device. It's almost like using thou to address somebody. Uh, it already draws attention to itself as dated. And so we really would only, maybe even in Stephen's time, this would have been used in a strictly ironic sense. So it creates distance from the very rhetorical underpinnings of the title. Because he's using irony here, at least I think he is, we have to almost doubt his seriousness. Will this be a comical poem, for example? Next, in his reference, he refers to the swans as ganders. But ganders are male geese, they're not swans. Now, certainly that would be a rhetorical attack on something. Uh, what do we associate first and foremost with swans? Their grace, their beauty. Perhaps because of their grace and their beauty, we assign them or we accord them an almost feminine respect, which the speaker perhaps is attempting to diminish through this confusion, so to speak, with male geese. Now, here comes our first explicit allusion, not to myth, but to fable. It's the fable of the goose and the swan. Now, in this fable, it's early morning, dark, I imagine, and the farmer takes his axe and goes into the shed in search of a goose to slaughter, uh, I presume, to make a meal. As I said, it was dark, and he did not lay his hand upon a goose, but upon a swan. Now, in the dark, they are not easy to tell apart, and he grabs the swan unintentionally and is about to chop its head off when the swan cries out, uh, being aware that the farmer has mistaken it for a goose. So, in this case of mistaken identity, the swan cries out to save its own neck. Now, immediately, another allusion is made to the swan song. In the swan song, well, what is a swan song? The swan song is the last great gesture that one makes in their career, perhaps. Perhaps it precedes retirement. Uh, what is the swan song? Well, it was a way of explaining why the swan, particularly the mute swan, is quiet throughout its life. As the fable or the myth goes, the swan is the swan is silent all its life and saves its song for the moment when it dies. Now that's quite a contrast, isn't it? In the swan song, the swan sings only once, only to mark its own death. It's somehow in keeping with its very, very beautiful, noble character. Compare that to the fable of the goose and the swan, where the swan sings not to mark its own death, but to save itself from death, from being confused with the goose. One might commiserate with the swan, but one might also accuse the swan of deviating from its own nobility and behaving in a rather cowardly manner. On the level of insult, the speaker appears to be telling the swan, by calling you gander, I'm going to make you cry out for being confused with something else. In other words, you're going to feel my insult and cry out in pain. Now, in both of these fables, these myths, the notion of death is not a topic in and of itself. It's merely used to identify something about the swan's character. In the sense of the swan song, it's perhaps identifies something about its nobility, also explains something about why it sings or does not sing, whereas here it turns that somewhat on its head and identifies, at least ironically, the less than noble, although obviously relatable, self-preservation streak in the swan. Um, of course, when we talk about the soul, we really are talking about death as a subject in of itself. The word soul, by its nature, must foreground the topic of death. Now, the soul is, by definition, the essence. It is beyond death. It's incorruptible. It's eternal. It's true nature. It's the part of us really that survives our mortal existence. It exists beyond death. Yet the word, when used, suggests death. So in that sense, it's bound up with the death that it exceeds, that it's beyond. Now it appears that what began as a nice invective, as a nice bit of rhetoric, is turning into a philosophical or theological reflection. What's going on here? Are there two natures to this poem? Um, well, at this point, we should go on and finish reading these lines. And with that, I'll finish this video. I think this will be a multi-part series on this poem. The soul, O ganders, flies beyond the parks and far beyond the discords of the wind. Now, because of the language used, this almost sounds like a generalization about the behavior of the soul. Now, the soul is a specific thing, but because we say it flies beyond the parks and not a specific park, it doesn't at first appear to us that we're talking about something that's happening right now. Now, in rather formal, maybe even a dated language, this present simple can refer to what is happening now. Like the man mows his lawn. Uh, Although normally when we use the present simple, we're referring to the man's habitual action. The man mows his lawn every Saturday. Now, if you notice, I wrote here a description of parks. My definition, I think, as you'll see, has been influenced by the rest of the poem. But let me just read it out. Parks are harmonious settings, carefully planned and maintained for pleasant whiling away of time. Parks are created, or what do we find in parks? Sculptures, statues, benches, greenery, ponds, and of course, what do we find on the surface of the ponds? Padding about, swimming about, swans. Very simply, this could be a little bit of a dig at swans. Swans, while you only fly in the vicinity of ponds, the soul flies beyond that. Now, why that's a dig is not immediately apparent. The speaker continues and says, and far beyond the discords of the wind. Now, this is very interesting. The wind is a meteorological phenomenon. It's turbulence without place. The word discord has been applied to the wind. Discord means something like disorder or strife. Now, there's a contrast, isn't there? There are parks, which are places, they're harmonious places, and yet we have this phenomenon without place that is very disorderly. The soul has nothing to do with either of them. It obviously has far less to do with discords of the wind than it does with parks. But also, the parks and the wind, as written here, also have nothing to do with each other. But that's not possible because wind is everywhere. Wind is found in the parks. So our minds force us to confront parks with these discords. In other words, our minds force us to create an event where the wind that turbulence, that disorder, that strife is located in these harmonious settings. So we have, by the action of our minds, the wind in the parks, events of contending opposites. And so not only is disorder, discord disorderly by itself, the discord itself is brought into discord with the harmony, which is something really very abstract. And the soul, while we say it is beyond these, and certainly beyond this, is defined by what it is beyond. It is defined by what it is not. It is defined by negation itself. So, as I've written here, the soul is defined by negation, just as it is defined by death. It cannot escape ever the thing that it escapes, because the only reason we talk about the soul is as an escape, kind of like an escape pod from mortality. It is what persists after our mortal remains decay and fade away. Now, still the question remains what this rhetorical activity, this rhetorical attack, has to do with something that seems to be far more philosophical and theological in nature. Because my video is already over 16 minutes, and as a good teacher, I know that the videos that go on too long go unwatched. I'm going to end here, and in the next part, I'm going to take up this middle portion, which is a very, very complicated, torturous, but rewarding as well. So I'll see you in the next part.